إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله صل على أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن عليا ولي الله أشهد أن عليا حجة الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين باعث الأنبياء والمرسلين الذي بعد فلا يرى وقرب فشهد النجوى نحمده ونستعينه ونثني عليه ونؤمن به ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف بريته ومبلغ رسالاته العبد المؤيد الرسول المسدد المحمود الأحمد أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين عباد الله أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله. We begin this first Friday khutbah by reminding all of you and myself to maintain the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We'll continue inshallah with the advice that the Prophet had given to the first Imam, and we reached this third of the teachings of the Prophet, وَالثَّالِثَةُ الْخَوْفُ مِنَ اللَّهِ عَزَّ ذِكْرُهُ كَأَنَّكَ تَرَاهُ. The third of those pieces of advice that the Prophet granted to the first Imam was to fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala كَأَنَّكَ تَرَاهُ, as if you can see Him. And we talked about what it means to fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I've mentioned multiple times before that this is one of the most misunderstood concepts in Islamic spirituality. What does it mean to fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And in reality, when Quran talks about fearing Allah, it's talking about a sense of accountability between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That you will not give yourself a green light to do as you wish. A person who, when he comes across haram, stops himself a little bit. He forbids himself, as the verses of the Quran says. This is a person who fears Allah, as Surah An-Nazi'at said. We mentioned last week that unfortunately this worshipping Allah out of fear is getting a bad rep. Why? Because the moment you mention fear in the words of people, in the eyes of people, it doesn't feel so spiritual anymore. Say, no, you should worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because you love Him. You should worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because you find Him worthy of worship. You should worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shukran lahu, because you want to be thankful for everything that He has given to you. You should not worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala out of fear. And this is true, of course, because the first Imam, as well as multiple other of the Ahlul Bayt, they said that there are different levels to worship, and the lowest level, which is where the majority of us would be or fall in, is worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala out of the fear of hellfire. But the reality is that in order to get to a level where I worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala out of thankfulness, because I find Him worthy of this level, so on and so forth, this is not possible unless I start from that basic level. And I mentioned this line last week, and I will reiterate it today, that if I am not willing to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if I'm not willing to take the promises of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the teachings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala seriously when there are consequences, there is no way I will be able to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just because it is Him. There's no way. You're not even taking God serious enough that when He tells you there's punishment for something, you don't act on it. Now you're saying, I want to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even if there is no punishment. With the punishment, you're not. With the punishment that He said you have to be thoughtful about the consequences of this deed, you didn't take Him seriously. You didn't consider Him significant. You didn't give importance to Him. Now you're saying, no, even if there's no punishment, I want to give significance and importance to Him. No, if you first start from the first level. The first level is to build the base level of humility. Oh Allah, You're in charge. There are consequences to my deeds. This is what it means to fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. Of those manifestations of fearing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one of those things that is considered an act of worship, and it's a consequence of fearing Allah, meaning understanding the consequences of my deeds, is what? Is this concept that we have in our narrations of crying out of the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This in and of itself is an important act of worship. It's considered a very big deal that you are able to come and sit and cry out of the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes, Allah salawat please. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad wa ajil farajah. What does it mean when I cry out of the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? It means I have now understood the graveness of that sin that I committed. It's not because I'm crying because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to come and punish me and what is He going to do now? No. His doors of His mercy are open. The moment I repented from my sins, what happened? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised His forgiveness. So the crying that we have in the narrations is not so much, oh Allah, I'm crying so that hopefully you will forgive me. That's also valuable, but that doesn't seem to be the main purpose of this crying. The main purpose of this crying is, oh Allah, what have I done? You've forgiven me, but I am now understanding what I did. And I gave this analogy last week as well. You know, sometimes when parents get older in life, sometimes they think about the mistakes they made with their children. Sometimes children themselves, when they get older in life, they look back at how they treated their parents. Yes? And the parent has moved on. You sit with the parent, the father says, it's okay. You know, beta, it's okay. This is part of parenting. The mother says, it's okay, my son, you don't have to worry about it. My daughter, you don't have to worry about it. But if that son or daughter starts to realize how they treated their parents, then you'll see every now and then, maybe a couple tears from their eyes. Not because they're worried that their parents may not forgive them, because their understanding of what happened has deepened now. And that understanding is very valuable in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Has a lot of reward in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For you to go from a person who commits a sin, for me to go as a person who commits a sin and doesn't consider it a big deal, to a person who commits that sin and understands it was a big deal. Just this paradigm shift is very important in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you understand what you did. Because then if you understand what you did, this can make it unlikely for you to commit these sins in the future as well. The deeper I understand the significance of what I have done, the less likely I will engage in it in the future. Hence why they said crying out of the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has this type of reward. So the Prophet told the first Imam, وَالرَّابِعَةُ, number 4, كَثْرَةُ الْبُكَاءِ مِنْ خَشْيَةِ اللَّهِ, frequently crying from the fear of Allah. If you do this, O Ali, يُبْنَى لَكَ بِكُلِّ دَمْعَةٍ, for every tear that leaves your eyes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will build for you أَلْفُ بَيْتٍ فِي الْجَنَّةِ, 1,000 houses in heaven. Why? Why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala this heavy reward? Because now your ma'rifah has increased. Now you've become a person who understands the significance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you understand the graveness of what you did, how grave your mistake was, how major your mistake was. You're a different person now. Hence you find these narrations, and this one is from the 6th Imam. He's quoting from his fathers all the way to the Prophet salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. The Prophet said, Allah, no, وَمَنْ ذَرُفَتْ عَيْنَاهُ مِنْ خَشْيَةِ اللَّهِ, the one whose eyes turn wet because of the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. كَانَ لَهُ بِكُلِّ قَطْرَةٍ قَطْرَةٍ مِنْ دُمُوعِهِ, for every tear that leaves his eyes, he will have قَصْرٌ فِي الْجَنَّةِ, he will have a mansion in heaven. مُكَلَّلًا بِالدُّرِّ وَالْجَوْهَرِ, be adorned with jewels and with gems. فِيهِ مَا لَا عَيْنٌ رَأَتْ, in that mansion will be things that no eye has ever seen. وَلَا أُذُنٌ سَمِعَتْ, and no ear has ever heard. وَلَا خَطَرَ عَلَى قَلْبِ بَشَرٍ, things that have never crossed the mind of a human being. For what? Because I cried? Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going on a power trip? No. Because I am becoming a person of understanding. I am becoming a person of ma'rifah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is very big. This is very big in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In another narration, we find that the narrator is quoting from the 6th Imam, Al-Imam As-Sadiq, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. He said, مَا مِن شَيْءٍ إِلَّا وَلَهُ كَيْلٌ وَوَزْنٌ, there's nothing of your deeds except that you can put something in front of it. It's equal to something. You can say, if you commit this deed, there will be this reward for it. Yes? إِلَّا الدُّمُوعِ, except for tears. فَإِنَّ الْقَطْرَةَ مِنْهَا تُطْفِي بِحَارًا مِنْ نَارٍ, because one tear, a drop of it, can remove oceans of fire. One drop of it. So people say, how am I supposed to fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and have hope in Him at the same time? Yes? How am I supposed to balance these two? It's very simple. You have to have a sense of accountability to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The moment you embrace that sense of accountability, the doors of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala open upon you. Quran said there are believers, they read the verses of the Quran, yes? تَقْشَعِرُّ مِنْهُ جُلُودُ الَّذِينَ يَخْشَوْنَ رَبَّهُم. Those who fear Allah, when they read the verses of the Quran, yes, they begin to tremble. Yes? And then the same Quran said immediately afterwards, ثُمَّ تَلِينُ قُلُوبُهُم وَجُلُودُهُم إِلَى ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ. Then they immediately calm down. How does this work? How does this process work? Because first there's a sense of accountability, there's consequences to my deeds. The moment he embraces that, he remembers that now he is worthy of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes, this is how we balance these two. So he said, every tear that leaves his eyes will remove oceans of hellfire. وَإِذَا غَرَوْرَقَتْ الْعَيْنُ بِمَائِهَا. And he said, you know what? Even if the tear does not leave his eye. إِغْرَوْرَقَتْ means what? Means that his eyes fill up with tears. Yes, he's not actively crying, but his eyes fill up with tears. لَمْ يَرْهَقْ وَجْهُهُ قَتَرٌ وَلَا ذِلَّةٌ. Never will that face be covered with the humiliation on the Day of Judgment. You know, the indication that the Quran speaks of the people who show up on the Day of Judgment, who will eventually end up in hellfire, the Quran says what? تَرْهَقَهُمْ قَتَرٌ. There is this darkness that covers them. And this is before they come for hisab. This is before they come to do the accounting of their deeds. The moment they show up, already there is this humiliation and there is this darkness on their faces. Yes? The hadith says the person who cries like this, or not even cries, his eyes fill up with tears. Yes? What happens? His face will never be given that darkness. فَإِذَا فَاضَتْ. If that tear leaves his eyes, yes? حَرَّمَهُ اللَّهُ عَلَى النَّارِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes him haram upon the hellfire. As in, he tells the hellfire that this person is haram for you. As in, he will never touch the hellfire. وَلَوْ أَنَّ بَاكِيًا بَكَى فِي أُمَّةٍ لَرُحِمُوا. If there is one person like this who cries out of the fear of Allah, maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will have mercy on the whole community that he is a part of. On the whole people that he is a part of. And we know that this has this type of effect. We know in our narrations that in the verses of the Quran have addressed this as well, that if you're within a group and within a community, and one of those individuals in that community is a special servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks at that full group and sometimes blesses that full group. Yes? That's why the Quran told the Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, as long as you're within them, you're amongst them, we're not going to send our punishment upon them. The moment they kick you out, the moment they get rid of you, that is when they become worthy of our punishment. And this is what happened with the previous prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well. As long as they were disobeying, but they still had some level of respect for their prophet, the punishment would not come. The moment they would kick their prophet out, the moment they would say, you have to leave us now, and now good and evil was completely separated from one another, that is when the punishment came. That is why the narrations tell us on the topic of dhuhur, that is one of the wisdoms behind dhuhur as well, or the ghaiba as well. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala awaits that time where the good people become the best that they can become, the evil become the most evil that they can become, and then they separate from one another. Then the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will then come. So these narrations, they all point to this idea. Now inshallah, a point that we'll cover in the following week is this. So is it really possible that such a small deed would have such a major reward? Can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant to very small deeds such great rewards? Doesn't this sound a little exaggerated? Not just with crying for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Say we cry for the love of Imam al-Hussein and the tragedy of Karbala. The narration says the sins of this person are forgiven. Really? Because of a couple tears, yes? why has Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted this type of reward to certain deeds that seem very small? The author of 40 hadith then gets into that discussion, and he explains the wisdom behind that as well. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us amongst those who can firstly say no to sin and can abstain from sin, and secondly, if and when they engage in sin, they understand the gravity of the action that they have engaged in. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. أثني عليه حامدا وأذكره مسبحا ثم أصلي وأسلم على نجيبه وجليله وحافظ سره الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرضين بأبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. اللهم صل وسلم على علي أمير المؤمنين وفاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين وعلى سبطي نبي الرحمة وإمامي الهدى الحسن والحسين سيدي شباب أهل الجنة وعلى علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي والخلف الهادي المهدي حججك على عبادك وأمنائك في أرضك. صلوات. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات. عباد الله أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله. We begin the second Friday khutbah by reminding all of you and myself to maintain the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We reach the verses يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تقدموا بين يدي الله ورسوله واتقوا الله إن الله سميع عليم. Beginning of Surah Al-Hujurat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches you and I that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to give a ruling on a particular issue, you should not place yourself ahead of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As in, you don't prefer your own opinion over the opinion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, over the hukum of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we discussed this last week, that many times in our communities there are multiple instances where we do in fact do this. Sometimes when we engage in this, it pushes us more towards a liberal approach when it comes to Islam. Sometimes when we engage in this, it pushes us more towards you can call it traditional or conservative version of Islam. And neither of them are in fact Islam. Because when I go ahead of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then I'm going to go towards the wrong path. This is why you find the Prophet had this adab, he had this manner. Before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would come and give him the ruling on an issue, he would not open his mouth to give his own opinion. And there are instances of this. Yes, Surah Al-Mujadilah is one of those instances where a lady came to the Prophet and complained to the Prophet. And the Prophet said, according to some of the sha'n nuzuls, that the Prophet said, there's no ruling on this. Let us await the ruling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes? And then the verses of the Quran were revealed. The Prophet had this sense of submission to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was going to decide, to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was going to reveal. Didn't come in and give his own opinion on things. Yes? And by extension, the Ahl Bayt and our Imams also did not do such a thing. Sometimes in our school of thought, there is an idea that has built over many years that yes, the Ahl Bayt from themselves, they used to come, they used to give their own rulings on different issues. No, the Ahl Bayt were very clear. Whatever they spoke of, whatever knowledge that they had, was knowledge that was granted to them from the prophets. It was not coming from their own pockets. Yes, it's coming from somewhere else. Otherwise, they didn't give themselves permission to do as they wish with the Sharia. Why am I pointing this out? Well, because historically, the Ithna Ashari school of thought is not the only school of thought in the Shia school of thought. Yes, it's not the only branch of Shiism. There's other branches as well. Sometimes you find in other branches the imam, the person who's leading that school of thought, gives himself the permission, a lot of flexibility to basically maneuver the faith and change the tenets of the faith, some of the core tenets of the faith. This is something that Ahlul Bayt were very careful about. They didn't give themselves permission to go ahead of the Messenger of Allah. And if they did share things, they said this is a knowledge that we were granted from the Prophet of Allah. Yes? And maybe there were items that were lost during the time of the Prophet. Maybe there were certain things that the Ummah had forgotten during the time of the Prophet. When the Ahlul Bayt came and said something, and we don't necessarily find it very clearly spelled out in other schools of thought, in the literature of other schools of thought, it may not be because the Ahlul Bayt are introducing something new. This is a technical discussion. It might also be because this was introduced by the Prophet, but it was forgotten. People moved away from it. People abandoned this practice, and hence the role of the Ahlul Bayt was to revive this practice again. And that is a technical discussion for another time. Not moving ahead of the Prophet. So verse number 2 of Surah Al-Hujurat then moves on to this. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu la tarfa'u aswatakum fawqa sawti an-nabi. When you're speaking with the Prophet, do not speak above the voice of the Prophet. Do not, take your voices above his voice. وَلَا تَجْهَرُوا لَهُ بِالْقَوْلِ. And when you're in his presence, don't speak so loud. When you're in his presence, lower your voices because of who you are in the presence of. كَجَهْرِ بَعْضِكُمْ لِبَعْضٍ. Don't speak the way you speak when you guys are just amongst yourselves. The Quran introduced an adab, a level of manners here. Said, listen, the general principle is this. When you're in front of a person who's not like you, it's a higher status in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's a certain level of manners you have to grant to this person. Now the Quran is pointing out the most significant example of this. This is the Prophet. But this applies at lower levels to other individuals as well. And I'll touch on that in just a second. So the Quran said, if you don't take this adab and this manner into consideration, what will happen? أَن تَحْبَطَ أَعْمَالُكُمْ. Big, significant claim the Quran is making here. The Quran said, if you don't abide by these manners, you know what happens? Your a'mal will become habta. Habt is what? Habt is when my deeds lose their value. Habt is when I've worked hard to carry these acts of worship, and then all of a sudden these acts of worship, they start to disappear. The ultimate form of habt is when I disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and I become a disbeliever. This is the full habt that everybody has talking about. Everyone has accepted theologically. A person who was a believer and then he becomes a kafir. The moment he becomes kafir, all of his deeds no longer have any value. They no longer carry any weight. Yes, and there's a discussion. Why is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cares so much about your belief system? Shouldn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala care more about what you do than your belief system? This is a discussion for another time. This is one of the most misunderstood issues our younger generation has on the topic of Islam. That they assume the only thing that matters in Islam is what you do, not what you believe. No, that is not correct. What matters is what you believe, and then after that, what you do. Both of these are crucial. Yes? That's a longer discussion. Inshallah, we'll leave it for another time. So the Quran said, if you don't adopt this adab and these manners, at least some of your deeds habt. Like, you may not realize it. You're talking to the Prophet like this. Quran said, وَأَنْتُمْ لَا تَشْعُرُونَ. It doesn't feel like it. You don't sense it in that way. But when you're talking like this without adab, at least some of your deeds are gone. Okay, so this adab, the Quran and Ahlul Bayt have emphasized this concept. Even if you are disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even if I struggle with adopting certain teachings of the faith, having adab when it comes to the religion has value in and of itself. In and of itself, it has value. In and of itself, it carries weight. If I can just show manners, if I can show respect to those things in the religion that are considered religious icons. Okay? Of those ways that I show respect to the religion, of those ways that I show adab to the religion and to the messenger of God and to the Ahl Bayt, even if I'm struggling with some of the teachings of Quran and Hadith, is that I don't publicize my sin. Publicizing my sin is against the adab, against that respect. Yes? You know, it's like a son. Yeah, maybe he doesn't listen to the father so much. Yes? This is one problem, of course, right? But the other problem is then if he comes in front of all the family, in front of all the relatives. Yes? And in front of everybody, he disrespects the father. This is different level. So, if I disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on a personal level, that's one thing. If I champion that disobedience, this is now the Quran is saying, you have to have some adab, some respect. So you struggle with this act of yours. Don't publicize it. Don't champion it. Don't justify it. Yes, I struggle with this. I know it's wrong. I'm working on myself. This is it. I don't go around telling this person, telling that person. I don't go around celebrating it. Yes? And I share this, and I've mentioned this in some of our previous talks as well. All sorts of sins. That this person struggles with drinking, for example. Okay, so you struggle with it. Don't publicize it. Don't bring it to your wedding. Don't bring it to this ceremony, that ceremony. Don't put it on your social media. Don't go around telling other people about it. This person has inclinations, yes, when it comes to the gender that he or she is attracted to. I'm talking extreme scenarios now, yes? Okay, this is something you struggle with. There is still a lot of value if you don't publicize this. There is still a lot of value if you keep this as an inner struggle between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Of course, you discuss it with people who can help you, but beyond that, championing it, putting it out there and saying, well, I have to be true to who I am. No, this is a desire you have. That person who is a Muslim, who God forbid struggles with drinking alcohol, for example, yes? He doesn't come out and say, this is who I am. I am an alcoholic Muslim. No, we don't do that. So I'm Muslim, I have this desire, I struggle with this desire, yes? And when you meet that person, you don't shake their hands, and he's not expected to say, Assalamu alaikum, I'm Muslim and I struggle with this sin. No. Somehow, some way, when it came to the LGBTQ issue, it became a thing that, no, you have to publicize it. In fact, there's a lot of pressure that if you don't publicize it, you're betraying others within that community. No. I struggle with this issue, even if I keep this hidden between me and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that itself has value. That itself, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks at that. Hence we find narrations, they said a person who commits a sin in private versus a person who commits a sin and then publicizes it, their situations are not the same. Not the same. Some of the narrations spoke about more forgiveness for who? For the person who keeps this between him and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and anybody else who can help him with the struggle that he is having. As long as he keeps it within that circle, this is a special place he has in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Adab, manners. So the Prophet, the Quran said when you come in front of the Prophet, this is the adab that you need to have. But this also extends beyond the Prophet as well. Because there are other groups that Islam also said when you're in their presence, adab is required. And adab, brothers and sisters, is a lost art in today's society. It's a lost art. Of those individuals, Islam said you have to show adab to his elders. Doesn't mean everything our elders say is right all the time. No, it doesn't mean this. Yes? But even if you're going to disagree, with adab, with kindness. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks at this. Parents, adab. With your children, adab. I don't know why and where we got this idea that because I'm the father or the mother, I can speak to this child however I like. I can discipline him however I like. No, no, nobody gave you that permission. Islam gave you the permission to discipline your child, yes? But in any shape you like? No. Did Islam give you the permission to discipline out of anger? No. You know, it's interesting, during the time of the first Imam, Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. There was a person, he had committed a sin. They were carrying out the disciplinary action for him, yes? And the person who was carrying it out went too far. Why? Because It got to him. A sense of power and maybe anger, so on and so forth, it got to him. So he went a bit too far, thank you. He went a bit too far. He went beyond the allocated amount for that individual, yes? So immediately the imam stopped him and told him to sit down, to be disciplined. I'm a father, I'm a mother. I don't have the right to just yell at the kids. Well, I'm feeding them, I'm doing this, yeah, but adab, manners. There's also rules for you too. There's rules for me too. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made these children tests for us. And I tell you, so many parents fail that test. Scary, scary. The hadith said, fear the dua of the one who has no one else to help him. Sometimes that person who has no one else to help him, is not the person who is only in Palestine. That's the biggest manifestation of it, right? Sometimes your own children can be that person. Sometimes my daughter-in-law can be that person. My son-in-law can be that person. Yes, we have to fear Allah. He said sometimes adab when it comes to your friends. Adab when it comes to other believers in general. How beautiful is it if I know that I'm dealing with another mu'min. And because I'm dealing with another mu'min, there's a bare minimum level of adab and respect when I deal with this person. This is very valuable in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even if I decide to disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is why, brothers and sisters, now speaking of these incidents that are happening today in Syria, these of course were people who before seemed to not have this adab at all, seemed to not have this respect at all for the family of the Prophet, and the shrines of the Ahlul Bayt. Now, because of certain reasons and changes that have happened and maybe a rebranding that has happened, there seems to be a little bit more respect that is taking place. We have to wait and see, inshallah. We have to wait and see, and all we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to bring the best for our brothers and sisters in Syria, that hopefully it doesn't turn into a place where foreign governments, intelligence services, so on and so forth, then turn it into their own playground. And that is a serious, serious threat. And it's very interesting now. We've had close to 500 strikes in Syria. 500 airstrikes where Israel said, we've carried out the biggest airstrikes in our history. In our history. And this is not small. When they say biggest airstrike in our history, that's really big. Yes? And not a word, not a comment. This is worrisome. This is worrisome, yes? Not a comment. And when they're pressed for comment, they still don't comment for it, yes? This is very worrisome, and hopefully Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the best of plans, hopefully, and decides the best of decrees for our brothers and sisters, inshallah, in Syria. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد وعجل فرجهم. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد وعجل فرجهم. Inshallah, before we begin the salat, let's take a moment to recite 5 times Amma Yujib, especially for our dear brother Wajat Siddiqui, who is still severely ill. And, his place is very empty here in every khutbah, every Jummah khutbah that we do, as well as many other brothers and sisters who are dealing with illness, inshallah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. أما يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء. 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 صلوات الله. الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. اللهم صل على محمد. وأن عليا حجة الله صلوات الله وسلامه عليه. حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل. قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يسبح لله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض الملك القدوس العزيز الحكيم. هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم يتلو عليهم آياته ويزكيهم ويعلمهم الكتاب والحكمة وإن كانوا من قبل لفي ضلال مبين. وآخرين منهم لما يلحقوا بهم وهو العزيز الحكيم. ذلك فضل الله يؤتيه من يشاء والله ذو الفضل العظيم. مثل الذين حملوا التوراة ثم لم يحملوها كمثل الحمار يحمل أسفارا. بئس مثل القوم الذين كذبوا بآيات الله والله لا يهدي القوم الظالمين. قل يا أيها الذين هادوا إن زعمتم أنكم أولياء لله من دون الناس فتمنوا الموت إن كنتم صادقين ولا يتمنونه أبدا بما قدمت أيديهم والله عليم بالظالمين. قل إن الموت الذي تفرون منه فإنه ملاقيكم ثم تردون إلى عالم الغيب والشهادة فينبئكم بما كنتم تعملون. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا نودي للصلاة من يوم الجمعة فاسعوا إلى ذكر الله وذروا البيع ذلكم خير لكم إن كنتم تعلمون. فإذا قضيت الصلاة فانتشروا في الأرض وابتغوا من فضل الله واذكروا الله كثيرا لعلكم تفلحون. وإذا رأوا تجارة أو لهوا انفضوا إليها وتركوك قائما. قل ما عند الله خير من اللهو ومن التجارة والله خير الرازقين. الله أكبر. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم ارزقنا توفيق الطاعة وبعد المعصية. اللهم عجل لوليك الفرج. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر.
سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده. سمع الله لمن حمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم ارزقنا توفيق الطاعة وبعد المعصية. اللهم عجل لوليك الفرج. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. يا لطيف ارحم عبدك الضعيف. الله أكبر. بسم الله وبالله الحمد لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر.
إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. لا إله إلا الله العظيم الحليم. لا إله إلا الله رب العرش الكريم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم إني أسألك موجبات رحمتك وعزائم مغفرتك والغنيمة من كل بر والسلامة من كل إثم
اللهم لا تدع لي ذنبا إلا غفرته ولا هما إلا فرجته ولا سقما إلا شفيته ولا عيبا إلا سترته ولا رزقا إلا بسطته ولا خوفا إلا آمنته ولا سوءا إلا صرفته ولا حاجة هي لك رضا ولي فيها صلاح إلا قضيتها يا أرحم الراحمين آمين رب العالمين. صلوات اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. There is no God except Allah, the All-Supreme, the All-Forbearing. There is no God except Allah, the Lord of the Noble Throne. All praise belongs to Allah, Lord of all the worlds. O Allah, I beseech you to grant me that which will call forth your mercy and make certain your forgiveness, and grant me a share of every virtue and safety from every sin. O Allah, do not leave any of my sins unforgiven, nor any grief unrelieved, nor any illness uncured, nor any defect unconcealed, nor any provision unenhanced, nor any fear unalleviated, nor any evil unrepelled, nor any need of which you approve and in which lies my welfare unfulfilled. O most merciful of the merciful, Ameen, O Lord of all the worlds. Salawat.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Inshallah, tonight we'll be having the family movie night. We'll be screening Muhammad, the Messenger of God. Tickets are still available to purchase. It will close at 2:30 p.m. today. So please get your tickets via the WhatsApp chat, the link that was posted there before then. We have also added cheese pizza and tandoori chicken pizza as additional food menu items people can purchase. This weekend, inshallah, we'll be having the Building Resilient Families workshop, pre-marriage workshop with Sheikh Sadi. There are limited seats. There are some spots left. Please register by tonight. Link again for that to register is also in the WhatsApp chat or shieldfamilies.org/Dallas. On December 21st, between 2 to 6 p.m., there will be the Who is Hussein blood drive. Carter Blood Care will be here to draw blood from people who wish to do that. There will also be a CFK program for the Waladat program of Bibi Fatima alayhi salam. Allahumma. And more details for that program will be announced shortly. And then finally, inshallah, on Tuesday, December 17th at 7 p.m., there will be a ladies tafsir and tea program with Sister Fatima, Sister Zara Hamka. Alama Zara Hamka. Salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله صلى على محمد أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله صلى على محمد وأن عليا حجة الله صلوات الله وسلامه عليه حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله استغفر ربي وأتوب إليه يا محسن قد أتاك المسيء وقد أمرت المحسن أن يتجاوز عن المسيء أنت المحسن وأنا المسيء فبحق محمد وآل محمد صل على محمد وآل محمد وتجاوز عن قبيح ما تعلم مني الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. الله أكبر. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم ارزقنا توفيق الطاعة وبعد المعصية. اللهم عجل لوليك الفرج. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وتقبل شفاعته وارفع درجته. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد. سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد. سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر. سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. يا لطيف ارحم عبدك الضعيف. الله أكبر. بسم الله وبالله الحمد لله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر.
إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما.
اللهم
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أستغفر الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم الرحمن الرحيم ذو الجلال والإكرام، وأسأله أن يتوب علي توبة عبد ذليل خاضع فقير بائس مسكين مستكين مستجير، لا يملك لنفسه نفعا ولا ضرا ولا موتا ولا حياة ولا نشورا. اللهم إني أعوذ بك من نفس لا تشبع، ومن قلب لا يخشع، ومن علم لا ينفع، ومن صلاة لا ترفع، ومن دعاء لا يسمع. اللهم إني أسألك اليسر بعد العسر، والفرج بعد الكرب، والرخاء بعد الشدة. اللهم ما بنا من نعمة فمنك، لا إله إلا أنت، أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. اللهم صل على محمد. I beseech the forgiveness of Allah, besides whom there is no God, the living one, the all-sustainer, the all-beneficent, the all-merciful, the Lord of majesty and munificence. I beseech him to accept penitence of mine as a servant who is weak, humble, needy, destitute, indigent, and miserable, a fugitive seeking refuge who has neither any power to obtain any benefit for himself, nor to avoid any harm, nor any power over his own life, death, or resurrection. O Allah, I seek your protection from a carnal soul which is never satisfied, from a heart that is not humble, from a knowledge that brings no benefit, from from prayers that are not taken up to the heaven, and from supplications that are not heard. O Allah, I beseech you to grant me ease after hardship, and relief after pain, and ease after distress. O Allah, whatever blessing we partake of comes from you. There is no God but you. I beseech your forgiveness and revert to you penitently. Salawat.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك يا رسول الله، السلام عليك يا حبيب الله، السلام عليك يا أمير المؤمنين علي بن أبي طالب، السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين. السلام عليك يا حسن المجتبى. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله الحسين. السلام على 9 المعصومين من ذرية الحسين. السلام عليك يا صاحب العصر والزمان. السلام عليك يا خليفة الرحمن. السلام عليك يا إمام الإنس والجان ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليكم يا أهل بيت النبوة جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته.